Welcome to this lecture on the liberal tradition in sociology. The liberal tradition started off with economists, actually, and was not just a theory, but more of a general Weltanschauung in the sense that, it was a political program that was instrumental also in pushing democracies and pushing the natural sciences more generally. But it was also kind of the foundation of the 19th century sociology as reflected in thinkers such as Herbert Spencer, the mandatory reading for today. So let's briefly recap the history of liberalism and approach a definition of what liberalism is. So liberalism could be said to start out with, what is the grandfather of economics, Adam Smith, who in the 18th century wrote these two key works, The Wealth of Nations and The Theory of Human Sentiments, that in a way established political economy, economics as a modern discipline, a discipline that largely deals with a subfield of society, which is the economic system. And also makes normative statements about what states are supposed to do and not to do in that system. And this theory was laid out in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, which you may probably know, basically a global bestseller as well. Less known is his Theory of Human Sentiment, published in 1759. Wealth of Nations is from 1776, in which Smith, who was employed basically as a philosopher, right, who taught courses also on astronomy and on anthropology and ethics. So this theory of human sentiments, in which Smith philosophizes about what the anthropology of human beings may be. And in the literature, there is also talk of the so-called Smith problem that refers to the inconsistency or potential inconsistency between these two works, where The Wealth of Nations, as we will see in a second, is sort of the forerunner of the Homo economicus idea of human beings as being self-interested, rational actors. Whereas the Theory of Human Sentiment depicts human beings much more as altruistic and motivated by also care for others and a cooperative spirit. In the 19th century, then, John Stuart Mill was probably the most pronounced liberal thinker, not just a liberal economist, but predominantly. His father was already the author of the most read introduction to political economy, and John Stuart Mill was basically educated as a genius by his own father and co-authored already the first revised edition of this political economy book. Basically already knew all of the classical languages by the age of 10. And had read most of the books that others read in a lifetime before entering adulthood. And John Stuart Mill is known for the system of logic, which we will turn to in a second, which is a bit of the origin of understanding the social sciences as a copy of the natural sciences. It's also a forerunner of this covering law approach, this deductive nomological model of explaining human actions. And it is also a model for an individualist kind of social science. In the other famous writings of his, The Principles of Political Economy, this is then the textbook, and On Liberty, John Stuart Mill does not only talk about what a political economy as a science should look like, but yes, he is also an economist in these books and a political writer, speaking in favor also of many normative statements. We will get to this in a second. Last but not least, I wanted to mention Herbert Spencer, who yes, is probably the founder of British sociology, one may say, and also a liberal of the 19th century, who is most known for his earlier work on social statics. Yeah, so from the title of this work, you can already gather that Spencer also had the idea that, let's say, the physical sciences should inform also social inquiries. And then Spencer wrote, let's say, many principles of, and basically that was a template title for introducing the sciences in various disciplines, among which also sociology, and this is also the reading then for today. So political economy at the time was not a very specialized discipline. It was sort of a portmanteau conception of social science that included economics, but also the social sciences, that wrote a lot about the interaction between something like the economic subsystem and the political subsystem. But basically is a catch-all kind of term that describes a non-specialized kind of social science. So I listed down here a database that is the making of the modern world, which it contains digitized versions of practically all English language writings on the economy between, I think, 1450 and 1850. And I think there's a sequel database that even goes up to 1950, at least until the copyrights enter the modern times. And what this database shows is that there are, I think, up to 6,000 book titles that contain the term political economy. So it was a book title also at the time, often meant also as an introduction for rulers into economic matters and just basically consultancy on how to manage the economy. And I mentioned this because this was an important genre also of the authors, these early authors that we deal with here. Recall also Karl Marx books, which often come with a subtitle, Political Economy. Okay. So liberalism is obviously a very colorful term. You probably all have noticed this when comparing the use of the term liberal in a European versus an American context, where in the American context, being a liberal is usually referred to as someone who is, let's say, politically rather on the center left, whereas when you use the term in the European or also German context, then being a liberal means that you are economically conservative in the economic sense. So this already shows that liberalism, or being liberal, has both a political and an economic dimension. And in both of these domains, the term liberal then refers to a freedom from sort of a negative concept of liberty, in the political sense, then that liberalism is the freedom from despotism, yeah, from arbitrary use of power. It's the liberty from political monopoly, yeah, so just one king, for instance, and it's also the liberty from class privileges. So John Stuart Mill, for instance, devoted quite some energy on criticizing the recruitment system, the traditional recruitment system of public servant or military administrations that gave positions not based on merit, but based on class affiliation. And political liberalism would then refer to yes, a political program in favor of enhancing the freedoms from all of these negative things that were associated with a feudal order. In the economic sense, then, it is also a freedom from, but then a freedom from economic monopoly, for instance. So yeah, think about the first antitrust regulation in the 1890s that went against the Rockefeller-like monopolies. So that is informed by economic liberalism. It's also referring to the freedom from any, let's say, price fixing activity or licensing laws. So think about the liberal rebellion against the traditional guild system, which basically regulated the consumer prices, that regulated who is allowed to exercise a certain profession, such as being a carpenter or not. Yes, economic liberalism then also refers to well, basically in economic policies then as the freedom from landed wealth. So one of the main opponents also of liberals and economic liberals in particular was the former class of landed wealth, so the aristocracy of the various countries, and the respective theories that justified the foundation of a society on landed wealth, most notably physiocracy, so physiocrat thinkers such as Quesnay, a Belgian economist of the 18th century, thought that agrarian wealth was the only legitimate and productive form of wealth. And Adam Smith and also 19th century thinkers all argued against this physiocracy as a theory and against also landed wealth as a political class. It's important to keep in mind that liberalism, despite putting such an emphasis on freedom, also, let's say, had mixed views, to say the least, on questions of colonial freedoms or also questions of freedom for women or also other minorities. I say mixed views because some of these liberal thinkers were quite radical in their proposals, John Stuart Mill in particular, who was also a very early defendant of women's suffrage and equal rights for women at a time when such things as property ownership were privileges of men. And liberal thinkers were also in favor at times for colonial freedom. Adam Smith in particular argued in favor, or let's say rather against colonial trade, but on the grounds that it was inefficient, not necessarily on the grounds that it was unjust. Other thinkers, however, were not as radical. So these were radical liberal positions in the 19th century. And one has to keep in mind that the writers of these liberal positions were themselves benefiting from, for instance, the British Empire. John Stuart Mill's father and Mill himself basically were employed by the East Indian trading company, which had the monopoly over the trade with East India and is not only known for, let's say, being one of the first global organizations or corporations, but also for using massive violence in extracting resources, in being engaged in slave trade, and yes, basically organizing the colonial empire of Great Britain. And these liberal thinkers were not only benefiting from, let's say, this extraction and exploitation at the time, but they were directly working in the administration, which apparently was so cushy a job that these thinkers were able to have an intellectual career at the same time. So note also that these thinkers, I mean, Adam Smith